So Danah will do a short introduction, then I have some questions for her to open up the conversation, and hopefully then you will take some notes and have something to ask her also, because there's a lot at stake in your own education and your own and our own futures, and I think that's very much what we are going to talk today when we talk about what designers should know. So thank you, Danah, for coming, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here in this very beautiful space. Thank you, Francisco, for the invitation, to Joanna and Ines and Center for Other Worlds, and to the museum. So I'm going to first start by reading the introduction of the book. You could really read it in one sitting anyway, so it's not very long. And then I'll read another small statement that I prepared. So, on 26th March 2020, architect, urban designer, activist, and critic Michael Sorkin died at the age of 71 after contracting COVID-19. A prolific writer, Sorkin was best known for his irascible critiques and joyful humor, as is apparent in 250 Things an Architect Should Know, an essay list which recently became a posthumous book. While trapped in my flat during the first UK lockdown, I became inspired by Sorkin, and I began compiling my own list, asking myself, can the designer think? Design must be theory-informed and intellectually rigorous, and designers should consider how the rigor of research is implemented in practice and reflected on. Unfortunately, design thinking has created divisions between the intellectual designer and the practitioner. Either you are too theory-driven, or perceived as much, or simply a practitioner. Despite the currency of design thinking from the early 2000s to today, where design has become the secret weapon of businesses and governments, the design world looks and feels almost exactly the same. Design thinking does not magically rid the world of bias. It is now masking it under the guise of innovation. Design thinking has crippled designers to generic tools and methods. If you take away the post-its, the A3 papers, and the markers, can the designer think? In posing these questions, I compile a list based on a search for knowledge and a designer's commitment to making the world a better place. I recall Antonio Gramsci's advice on how to think and know critically. The starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces, without leaving an inventory. The first thing to do is to make such an inventory. I take Sorkin's list and I compile one for designers, keeping some lessons he mentioned that are relevant to designers and adjusting them when necessary. The list is generic. It applies to all designers, no matter their specialization, as every designer also needs to be a generalist. The list is a work in progress, ending at 240 items. It is, as any piece of design, an iterative work. The list is not in any particular order, and there are items that people might agree or disagree with. This list is not to be seen as a definitive how-to guide, but to spark conversations, to prompt critical thinking, and to help designers reconfigure their discipline. Therefore, there is no correct way of using it. This was first performed as a text during the Back to the Future conference organized by Loughborough University in July 2021, and as a publication, the text invites readers to contribute their own items or rewrite existing ones by leaving space on the pages. My intention is to constantly iterate this list, and I invite readers to share their items by using the hashtag 240 designerly things. So you could see here that there's just images on the screen, and they're frankly just compilations of things, of the first thing that came to mind when I thought of one of the entries of the book. It isn't every single entry, that would be a lot of things, but I guess the idea is that also every image for someone else becomes something different. So whatever I think this statement reminds me of may be different for you. And I think, Francisco, you asked me to reflect on kind of where this book came from and you know, maybe pedagogically, frameworks and so on. And I think when I thought about this question is that this idea for the book came from observing how much of the narrative around design must change, how we're kind of repeating this call ad nauseum is accompanied by few approaches to consider what it actually means in theory and practice. I also thought when writing this book, again, sitting in my flat under lockdown, it was also a general societal observation that we were merely thinking that everything is an individual problem rather than something as collective responsibility, and that if we implemented positive thinking, we could have a better life. So, for example, you can think of the mental health crisis, where we assume the responsibility is on oneself and not necessarily a structural issue, and where the world becomes a series of targets to hit, to meet, most of which are kind of meaningless pieces of bureaucracy, and where we seem unable to think critically of the services that are taken away from us and that the things that come into place instead of them, that replace them. The meaningless bureaucracy and target setting is so prominent in education, and I'm of course speaking of the UK context, but I'm assuming that there is some similarities to the Portuguese context. And while you have some designers who are calling for disciplinary change, and led by a few who themselves are surrounded by people who have no idea what this actually means beyond a checklist in front of them. And then on the other hand, you have this increased pressure on students who graduate, and because there's such large tuition fees, again speaking in the UK context, to get into full employment because of the cost of studies. So then this concept of targets becomes a really easy way for you to package these calls for change and kind of as a tick box exercise while still meeting the needs of students of employability, but also because they're paying so much that you're kind of changing the targets within education, that you're sort of, there is a sense of shifting the goalposts and the rules a little bit without really thinking about, okay, what does this BA or MA course mean in the context of what the students are living in now? So inhabiting this space of contradiction, how can we actually equip students and designers with critical thinking skills, which is what university education is meant to be? I wanted to create a live tool to support this, you know, one that students, educators, and practitioners can work with. Now we know that design loves guidebooks and maxims, and I think one of the images you'll see is a list of those. So what makes this any different? Maybe that's why the book is actually kind of popular, is because it does look like a guidebook. So I wanted to create something that doesn't feel necessarily prescriptive, that countered the dangerous positive messaging that many of these guides and many of these maxims promote. And I think that's what drew me to Sorkin's list, because it has this sense of criticality and a sense of hope. And the relationship to Gramsci's inventory makes this design because it is about iteration. So this idea of one adding to their inventory, to their tools. And thanks to the curator, Cecilia Casabona, 4 designers did that in an exhibition in Dutch Design Week, and you'll see one of the images here as well, and that was last month. And designer Eleonora Toniolo crafted a whole conversation workshop around the book, where she had 3 points of view, so the ambivalent, the uncertain, and the enthusiast. And guests were invited to form a question based on the scarf that they found on their chair. So it was either one of these 3, and a statement from the book, and then they had to formulate a question, but from that point of view. And that was actually quite difficult for some people. But what it tells me about this piece of work is it is quite interpretive, and it can be worked into several tools for teaching and learning based on what you get out of it. And I think that that's one of the successes and one of the goals of it. And the book continues to look at the work that I'm really interested in, which is the new narratives and practices that go beyond disciplinary boundaries. It helps designers to ask the questions that support framing the problems, and also tries to support them to venture out of their comfort zone. to move beyond the idea that design is merely outcome-based, and this division of theory and practice into a more meaningful dialogue between the two. Really, it's about countering the disimagination machine, and I always refer to the late Mark Fisher's article, "No One is Bored, Everything is Boring," where he says, if we are bored, then it is for us to produce something that will fill up the space. But now we are not allowed to be bored because that capacity has been absorbed as a result of the constant dispersal of attention by what he calls capitalist cyberspace. And when you see outcomes, you know, they're almost exactly the same. You're kind of churning out these similar solutions and our devices, and everything is kind of everywhere all at once that is grabbing our attention, so we don't have this issue of, we don't have boredom. We're sitting in a queue and we're basically looking at our phones, and we're looking at copies of copies of copies, and that's initially what Mark Fisher was saying. And also, when I'm saying that all outcomes look the same, is that you're also seeing this absence of critical thinking, where reform is mistaken for revolution through things like, you know, Airbnb and Uber and all that. But I think I'm going to stop here and let you and the audience ask me questions.
Yes. Well, I had prepared a couple of questions, having in mind our audience and specifically students, because I think this book is very much about questioning if the education we're having is the education we want to have or should be having for the futures we are planning or hoping for or questioning. And the first question starts with your introduction, and of course it's very humorous always now to question and to call into question design thinking, and this opening question is really to ask if it's now well, 5 years ago already a defunct term, or if there's still any hope with some rethinking of language, and how should design students now still deal with this terminology and all the baggage attached to it?
I think, you know, the term itself has been hijacked by IDEO and the post-its. Is kind of if you think about this, what image comes to mind when you think design thinking? You think, you know, the post-it notes, you think of IDEO. But it is just taking a generic term, design thinking. So if we can kind of decouple that image from the idea of thinking and associate different things with it, do we then regain ownership over the term? I think whichever way, it happens with a lot of terms. It happens with even decolonizing design, right? Where this idea of changing the content of one's reading list, so this idea of reform being mistaken for revolution, which I just mentioned, it becomes where people just associate that with it. But I think there's always work done in the background to not necessarily try and redefine that term. I'm not necessarily as concerned with trying to redefine it, because I think there will always be people who misinterpret what certain terms mean. And I've learned to be okay with that, as long as so for example, if someone is using it within the context of, in a discussion, saying, oh, I want to decolonize education, and I'll be like, that's not it. You know, I'm able to do that and kind of articulate my own interpretation of that term. And I think that's how I'm viewing this idea of design thinking. This is one way for me to take over and kind of bring another concept, or the original concept, of what we mean by design thinking and design knowing, because obviously the title is taken from also Nigel Cross's very famous article called Design Early Ways of Knowing, which I thought was such an interesting kind of description of what one does. And so you're giving it a new and a different life. But personally, I'm not so concerned with fighting the fight over, you know, a new definition of design thinking. Maybe it is slowly dying, and you know, but this is a new way to kind of revive it in a different understanding, possibly.
Yes, well, I think this ties very well to the idea of universality, because we're always sold at the same time the uniqueness of what we do or can do, but at the same time the banality and the ubiquity of what we do, and everyone can do the same. I'm not even talking about automation. There is this sense of this contradiction of double reading of universality.
Yeah.
And this is something that is observable throughout the book, this questioning and challenging an idea of universality. And so this second question would be asking, how do you challenge all these different contradictions within this spectrum in the programs that you lead at UAL?
It's a very difficult undertaking, I think, because this idea that design is universal is quite embedded, I think, in I guess, Europe and North America. And then you have other places in the world from the so-called global south that sort of look to these different spaces for copying their programs in many ways. There is some change happening, but it becomes where universal design is the only point of view. And that's what discussions around decolonizing design are attempting to combat. And that's a difficult task when you have these targets and measures of people going tick boxes, right? So that's a main challenge, and I think, sorry, I forgot the mic was there. That's the main challenge for me as somebody heading a department in terms of how do you view design. Okay, so I'm stuck with these disciplinary boundaries which are almost immovable, right? And I don't know why they're immovable. I think, maybe your generation will be the ones that actually move us away from this idea of very strict confines. And even though a lot of these discussions talk about us moving away from strict disciplinary definitions, I feel like more and more, and I have written about this in the book and the book chapter on design struggles, is that the more things that we think about, the more that they become another descriptor for design. So it becomes interaction design, it becomes transition design, it becomes decolonizing design, even though it's not meant as an offshoot or a discipline, right? It's meant to kind of inform everything. And that's why this is targeting all designers as generalists. I'm not speaking against specialization, but over-specialization leads to very narrow thinking and understanding of the world, and I think there's such a great danger in that. And so this idea of the designer as an amateur, which is what, Edward Said always promoted, the intellectual as an amateur, which is quite important because you delve into all these things, and that's what design is really about. And this universality, I think I'm in two minds about it, because in a way there's things that should be universal, like USB keys, but they're not, or how to charge your phone. There's like 100 billion different things, and you go to the house and there's all these like wires, and just make wire, just one. And then there's things that people think should be universal, and that everybody uses something in the same way. But what I'm trying to do with this, or what I try to do with my students in the classroom when I get the rare chance to teach nowadays, is to think about how people, and I know you had a question there about affordances, what are the connotations of certain objects, how people use objects beyond what you thought that use would be. So this idea that I create something, but what I create then goes out into the world, and accepting the fact that when it goes out into the world, it's no longer in your hands what people do with it. And I think that's what makes design so interesting. And so this idea of universality, it has to be taken with a grain of salt, because I think design education tends to push the idea that what you're creating is universal and and that's why you have a lot of students and even designers that say this object is for everybody, but it's not for everybody. So what does that mean? How do you begin to unpick this? And I think there's a long way to go with that. There's a lot of challenge to that. But it's a lot of slow work. Yeah.
Well, I think connected with this idea of universality is, of course, politics, and design as politics, or design politics. It's central to what we do at COW, and we've been trying also to embed it increasingly in the program. But again, we always face, as design thinking, the usual barriers of design activism as a fad, and literal interpretations of what design as politics can be by doing posters or prints or stencils or temporary or illustrations or temporary workshops in which students talk supposedly about politics, but sometimes overlooking a wider spectrum through our lens through which they should question their practice and their own education and their own futures. So this question is again asking you to unpack this idea of design politics in education, and through 3 different points that you have in the book. One of them, what went wrong at the Grenfell Tower, which I think is quite illustrative of many other examples around the world. Design's unintended consequences, which is something that often we don't think about, especially within a graphic design context, because we tend to think that it's less material. And finally, the power of public and collective ownership. And so this idea of collectivity that you mentioned, and this point, I think it's, again, very illustrative of the great value of the book, is that each point offers you many different interpretations and readings and connections to other previous points, and so this is just another opportunity for you to unpack this presence of design politics within the book and education.
It's a big question, and I think, you know, what the good thing about the book is that a lot of things are also interrelated, and it is meant to be read in one sitting, so you sort of see the relationship between those. You know, you have Grenfell Tower and Düsseldorf Airport are, in a way, two similar things, but slightly different. For example, Grenfell Tower was also associated with how cheap design makes one feel less valued, because they used cheap materials, and that cheap material ended up being extremely flammable, killing over 70 people in the UK, which was just, you know, you're kind of watching this thing burn. The other thing is they couldn't find the exit, right? And this is also another situation that happened in Düsseldorf Airport, where I believe 12 people died, because when you're, and this is where the tie with graphic design comes in, is that usually when you're building a building, you do want to hire graphic designers in order for them to create the wayfinding, you know, how do you work with architects on the plans and where people can find, if a fire were to happen, where do you go, how do I identify it, etc. People couldn't find the exit, and therefore they died in a fire in an airport because of what was possibly cost savings, or it could be so much so that a cost saving could be, okay, well, the architects say, I'll just do it, you know, and that happens quite frequently. So it's important to understand how, you know, those two things are related, because one used cheap materials, and there was no space for anyone, couldn't find the exit if they were trying to get out. So that's the idea of also design's unintended consequences, which also, to go to this one, design's unintended consequences, to what I was saying earlier, is, you know, when you create a car, right? And that car then creates other consequences. It creates a predator for animals, you know, such as raccoons, foxes, cats, dogs. It becomes something that they can get killed. It becomes an enemy for humans as well. Now you inhabit a life where you must accommodate a vehicle. Cities are built to accommodate vehicles, to cars. We have parking spaces that take up loads of spaces. You have the fear of, say, I'm on a bicycle and I may get hit by this car. So there's all these different consequences that come with the things that you create. And of course, you can't always create something and say, this is absolutely 100% foolproof and solid, because there will always be something that happens. There's always going to be a pro and a con it depends what that balance is. With a car, you create dependency, you create unwalkable cities, you create pollution, you create demand for gas, you and so on and so forth, right? So I think that's what's also important, is when you're creating a thing, what is the impact of this thing? What are the possible impacts of this thing? You create packaging, you create the problem of disposing of that packaging. And just to have that thinking when you are creating is so vital. Not that it becomes kind of, what's the word, paralyzing, but that you do give more thought to what you are also creating. With graphic design, the best example is always visual pollution, right? When you create all this ability to just advertise businesses, and it's also tied to no regulations. If you just put a whole bunch of signage everywhere, that actually impacts on people's well-being and the life they lead, alongside noise pollution, alongside pollution of just kind of living in cities and so on. And the power of public and private ownership, I think the one example that always comes to mind is related to one of the images here, which is kind of, I guess, one of the father of Afrobeats is Fela Kuti. And what was interesting about Fela Kuti is that he worked with this designer called Lemmy. He designed maybe about almost 30 of his covers. But what he enabled Lemmy to do was that he gave him ownership over his work. Fela Kuti does not own the ownership of his covers, which is unheard of as a designer, really, because it's sort of like once you design something, you're kind of giving it to that label. Again, sorry about the mic. I would prefer a Madonna mic next time, if you don't mind. Or Beyonce, I think maybe that's more of your generation. But in any case, he kind of had this relationship with the work where the copyright was completely owned by him, and Fela Kuti never got involved. He was like, I trust you to do whatever you do, and you kind of spread it in the way, and you can remix it as much as you can, which brings forward another aspect of how we deal with copyright and working with our images. And I think for designers, that's important, because all your work, and with graphic designers in particular, because I guess out of all of the design disciplines, we are the closest to what we make if we're still sort of sitting on a computer and making that thing. It becomes a new way of thinking about who owns this piece of work and how do I want people to engage with it, remake it, iterate it, make it better in some ways.
Well, I think this connects well to the idea of not only when you produce something, you're occupying the space of something else that could be existing in place of what we are doing or creating or producing, and to the idea of design myths that you mentioned in the book. The most resounding one is that I would like you to expand is the why the lone designer genius is a myth, and this is something that is still continuously cultivated across the world in design schools. This idea that you need to perform, you need to have your individual evaluation, you need to have a specific mark and performance, and therefore you are qualified, or you qualify as a professional or proper designer, and you are encouraged to have your own research and development, and to provide that portfolio and individual showcasing in order to be considered successful in your path as a design student. And so this is a question for you or this is a request for you to expand on this myth. Maybe if you can include the dangers of short-term decision making, which I think it's quite relevant for specifically for graphic design students, because there's a lot of short-term decision making, especially on the night prior to the deadline, and what's at stake.
Yeah, I think the lone designer myth is, it's not just, I think, for design. I think it's across the board with many things. You know, this, because of the way that history is written, it highlights the accomplishments of one specific person. But I think if you really read into these stories, you understand that most people, well, there are a lot of people who are kind of these forces of nature who just kind of take on and do everything on their own. Within design, it's completely impossible. It's impossible for, and I have an image of Raymond Loewy, who's I think the best example when you think about product and industrial design, as this person who fundamentally changed the way that we deal with objects or we view objects, and he may have, but he didn't create these things on his own, right? He may have done the sketch, but he needs to work with the model maker. He needs to work with the engineer. He needs to understand manufacturing processes. He needs to deal with whoever he's making the car for, so General Motors, Ford, whoever. And so this idea that, and the same thing with fashion design, I think fashion design is where it's the most prominent, you know, much less, say, in the other disciplines it is as well, but in fashion design, you know, you talk about labels, you refer to a designer's name. And there's this myth that all of these fashion designers actually designed all the clothes themselves, whereas the hidden labor behind, usually women, are nowhere to be seen, right? And it's the same thing with anyone that has a kind of the designer name on it, and I think that's where it comes from. You know, you sort of emphasize this one person, and it becomes the designer as artist. And I think that's where that leads to a point. And I do find that there is a problem with that idea that the artist also is the only person who is producing their thing, because actually most artists are reliant on others to help them with the work. Sculptors, for example. And I think a lot of contemporary artists now, when you kind of go, a lot of the work is done by someone else rather than the artists themselves. So design can never be the work of one person, because it always involves other people in the production of it. And I think that schools don't help, because when they have collaboration, it's kind of added onto a class where you all have to go work in groups now, and you end up hating the teachers for it because you're having problems within a group. And that's perfectly understandable, because you're never actually, I guess from school, I mean, it depends on the schooling, obviously, it could have changed since then, but that there isn't this teaching of how to work with others in a meaningful way, where how do you deal with conflict, how do you negotiate, how do you communicate, et cetera, et cetera. This doesn't really happen. Students are put in a position where they literally have to work with people they've never met before and expected to produce something great. But instead it's like you have conflict, you deal with it. You're not actually giving them the tools in order to understand, how do I collaborate? How do I work within, okay, I disagree with this person. These are really important skill sets to becoming a designer. But instead it's like, okay, my grade is dependent on this person who isn't doing anything and who hasn't shown up in like 3 weeks, right? So there's issues with how that's structured. It's also the issue of you're assessing someone individually and then you're assessing them collectively. And that causes problems. And then throughout their entire journey, they are assessed individually. So I guess it's ways of looking at assessment is important, but that's not easy, because you have all these other kind of layers of bureaucracy, of ministries of education, that you have to meet certain criteria. And perhaps our role isn't necessarily in the classroom itself, in terms of what we're teaching, how we're teaching, that's one thing. But it's how we're informing the policies of, okay, if we want design education to change, to be more reflective of actually what designers do or can do, isn't our work meant to be within these spaces of policy and government where they're making those decisions, you know? So what was the other part of that you wanted me to touch on?
Well, it was the dangers of short-term decision making.
Well, here we go. Yeah,
it's very much connected to what you said.
Yeah.
I will try to open up to the floor. We'll just ask one last question, which is about when not to design, and why both ourselves or as designers and as students shouldn't limit ourselves by the imagination of others.
It's a very good one. Well, we can just look at the world that we inhabit and see how there is such a lack of imagination in any of the things that have been created. Again, revolution mistaken for reform. So when you start to think critically about these things that have come out, I guess you start to see the world in a very different way. When not to design, that ties very much with the design's unintended consequences. Because it's like, if I start to think about this thing that I'm making and the consequences it may have, sometimes you're like, oh, I just make it anyway because it's going to make a very small percentage of people happy. But actually, I may create this incredible dependency. We can think of the phone as an excellent example of dependency. Yes, it's this amazing object that we have in our pockets that is basically a computer, and it does all of these different things. However, what does this act of swiping and convenience create for society, right? So kind of thinking about these things, you know, it's like the creator of the drone. Oh, I never thought it was going to be used to kill people. Really? But it's this object that is actually, you know, and I get to see people I can be in Lisbon and just do it in Afghanistan. It's kind of this insane approach. It's because thinking about what you're doing and what effects it could have, and that's what it comes where you're actually critically thinking about your practice. I think right now we just don't think beyond the positive of what we make, and that there will be only positive outcomes. And that's why sometimes it's actually better not to design. The limitation of other people's imagination, of course it's difficult to be entirely kind of innovative and all things come from what came before. But what I really mean by that is I guess a good example is looking at Twitter right now and Elon Musk's takeover. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not really interested in Twitter. I'll go on the decolonizing design one once in a while and just see what, you know, an article someone posted, okay, and then you just realize that most of it is just like this monologue. It's not very useful. But then he comes in and starts kind of getting rid of people, and it's never made a profit as a company. So the first thing he does is really simple. He does what everyone else does: subscription service. It's the same thing with Adobe Creative Suite becoming subscription service. That becomes another barrier, you know, thinking about these. But then what is it now? Pantone is going to charge you for using certain colors. So if you had, let's say you created an InDesign file in 2016 and you used, I don't know, Pantone 378. Well, Pantone 378 is going to cost you now $10 a month or something, or you're going to have to buy a package, so that color won't work anymore. So then you kind of have to look at, I mean, you can still get the hex codes and CMYK codes, and in a way it'll work, but the fact that even color is becoming something that they're making a profit of, despite the whole industry of color itself, is absolutely nonsensical, but also shows you this limitation of the imagination, is that I really need to make a profit, everything becomes a subscription service. And we don't really think about it because convenience trumps that.
Thanks, Danah. I would open it to the floor. I would have definitely more questions, but I don't know if any of you had the possibility to read the book in advance, but there's plenty of material from what Danah has been talking about for you to have some questions or provocations or requests for clarification. So anyone, I'm sure there's a mic around. Yeah. Okay. Any questions?
There's one there in the back.
Hi, my name is Elena, and I'm a huge fan of your work. So I'm here girl fanning. So my question is a little bit coming back to your introduction, where you touched just very briefly about the need to sort of fill the gap in between academia and the theoretical sort of side of critical theories connected to design politics and the practical side of actually designing. And I just finished a master in social design and sustainable innovation, and I find myself struggling to sort of coming out of my bubble of a very privileged, because it's a private university for which I had to pay a lot of money in order to get a knowledge that for me should be sort of accessible to everyone, especially designers. And then I come out and I try to sort of fit my critical thinking and sort of develop a way of designing in a different way, in a structure that is very much defined. And my question maybe has definitely many different layers, but how can we make design education more practically enabled for designers, especially after getting out of education? Although it is important to, you know, have discussions within the university, in the classroom, with students, but then I heard many times, and I also experienced myself once we get out of university, we're sort of like there in the world and we're faced with the fact that these structures are very strong, and how can we sort of fill this gap and make also this sort of knowledge more accessible that goes beyond paying a really high tuition fee for a university degree. Obviously, it is, I'm not saying that we should just throw education and universities in the bin, but also I truly believe that this sort of knowledge should be more accessible in general. And I just find myself really struggling to even explain all the things that I learned and how I am practically implementing them in my work as a designer. And people are sort of like not really understanding, and that is limiting a lot, let's say, the impact of my work in that sense. Sorry, it was
no worries.
it's a huge question, but I hope you understand it.
Yeah, I'll try my best to respond. Thank you very much for your question. I think the first thing you say is, how do I make the knowledge that I've gained more accessible? I think that's kind of one of the main challenges of being and understanding that design or anything, there's always an audience or sort of a user, for lack of a better word for it. And where is it that you find yourself, and how you begin to communicate what you're doing based on kind of that segmentation. I think that's a key skill that we also still fail to teach, and it's a difficult one. You know, it goes back to that idea of like, oh, what I'm doing, what I create is for everyone, but there is no such thing as everyone, because everyone is also kind of complex. We're all complex beings, and it goes even to which platform you use. You know, let's say I'm a publication and my readership goes from 18 to 65. I am not going to advertise the exact same way for 18 to 65. I'm going to segment, you know, my users that are within this age range. They may use TikTok, they may use Instagram, these people, you know, so you can kind of think of it in that way. Who is my audience? What am I, and what do I want them to know, and how do I begin to craft what I do, what I learned? And that's a very difficult task, and that's probably an ongoing thing that you will constantly do throughout your life. It's like with anyone, explaining their value to society in a way that they understand. How do I make this knowledge more accessible beyond a privileged education? Yeah, I think that's kind of a question that many people have of, if I'm going to have a social design degree and I'm spending 50,000 euros for it or whatever, who does that attract, right? You know, the world that you currently inhabit is a very different one from when, I don't know, even kind of 10, 20 years ago, right? There's this big shift in terms of how students, I know that our students, a lot of them are in full-time employment, and they're paying about £9,000 a year, and they're living in London, which is an extremely expensive city, and they sometimes don't show up to class because they're working 40 hours in order to pay for that education. And even though you want to help support them, you know, there's only so much that you can do if they've missed all these classes. but the university doesn't necessarily see, or the government doesn't help support students who want to study part-time. And we don't have part-time courses. But what is the possibility of a part-time course that actually fits with this student's schedule, and that way it becomes more affordable. But then there's more focus with paying more money on getting a job, concrete job, and that's why there's less funding towards the arts and the humanities, because it doesn't translate as something lucrative, which is just silly, because you're not kind of seeing its value. At the end of the day, also, so the idea that if design comes into a different space, it's different than in university. University is really about building your critical thinking skills. Personally, I could care less if you became a designer, right? And that sounds really bad, but no, it's not. It's like, you could be, but I know that not everyone's going to be, and that's okay, because that form of thinking, of knowing that you're learning in university, becomes applicable to working in different fields that actually may be of more value in a way, right? And that may be your strength. So that's always something that I wish students would understand coming in, because a lot of them actually don't even like design, but because they've reached a stage that they're too far in. I've invested all this money, do I give up? I say finish your degree, but then how do you apply what you've thought into a different area that actually interests you? And it becomes a whole other possible world for them. So making this knowledge more accessible, I think, is thinking about the different spaces that it could inhabit. And yeah, I mean, I guess it depends. I think there's a lot of design skills, or skills that feed into being a designer, that can be taught at different levels of schooling. And yeah, I mean, I don't know how to answer this in any other way. I think you talked about something being more practically enabled. Maybe I've touched on this, but I'm not, and I think that ties into this idea of knowledge being more accessible. I guess it's this idea of how do you, if I'm understanding your question correctly, is how do you learn to speak to these audiences in a more practical way, in demonstrating, okay, yeah, this is all done and good, you have this expensive university degree, but what does it do for me? And I guess that's that idea of how do you communicate based on who you're communicating with. I know it sounds really simplistic, but actually it's one of these things that people don't think about enough. You know, who am I speaking to? Who's my audience? And that has to change my messaging and my approach.
Thank you.
There was someone at the back, yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I've been grappling with the question regarding the notion of design as a tool versus the designer as a tool. I think as designers, we are requested at times a specific skill set that makes us, towards the clients or the people we work with, as tools themselves. And it's sometimes a hard box to get out of. And considering we are talking about design thinking and the possibility of designers applying these notions to something more than the specific skill set of software working, making a poster, making a book, whatever. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on these notions and these frontiers and how to cope with them.
It's an interesting question, because I think it's one that we get quite often in terms of, yes, everything you're saying and this criticality is really important, but at the end of the day, I have to end up working in an industry with a client that treats me like X, Y, Z, right? And it becomes this sort of crutch and almost in a way an excuse for you to continue not thinking critically about the world you inhabit. And this is very dangerous, right? I understand where it comes from, because I have been there, right? Where it's like, oh, could you just make this one change? Oh, you just do this. Yeah, I get it. It's tough. But without equipping yourself of thinking about how, and this is why I use Fela Kuti as an example, because he had such a different relationship with the people he worked with. And of course, that's in a very kind of cultural space in an entirely different continent. But that doesn't mean that these new working relationships can't happen, right? Is that if people think of them launching a studio or working for an agency is going to be the exact same way, then it will be. You will continue to practice business in the same way. But if you start to think about like, okay, what kind of work do I want to do? What kind of relationship do I want to have? And that goes to the power of public and private ownership and collective ownership, sorry, is, you know, what kind of design industry do I want to create? And also, what does industry actually mean? So one of the things that I've been actively trying to work on in the department that I head up is that we don't think of it as an industry, because industry is very much advertising and studios and these traditional ones, but as sectors. What sectors does design find itself in? And where it can be. And so then you as a designer have a more expansive view of where you could work that goes beyond you're a designer in a studio working on X, Y, and Z. And then you start to work in different sectors, and then you can start to shape what your role is in the decision making. If, you know, usually we have communication graphic designers who come in at the very end of the process, but then how do we start to bring ourselves more at the forefront to inform the decisions? And that's where this idea of being more critically minded comes in. And I think it's quick to think that it's like, oh, how am I going to change the industry? You may not, but you may pave the way for others to do so. I'm very well aware that what I'm doing now in education, I mean, I might not see the change that I want to see in my lifetime, but I can try and set the kind of steps of how do we do things differently, and to get people to think differently about how they live and how they practice in order to inform different decisions. If you think about the world we live in now, a lot of the things we thought were impossible 40 years ago are a reality, aren't they, right? So if you kind of keep that in mind and work collectively, because again, it's not all the work of one person, you will burn out. So that's a positive spin on that, but it's not an easy task. And it's not easy to say no, and it takes a certain amount of privilege. But again, it goes back to the other question of how do you communicate with this audience for them to begin to understand what more you can provide in a small way.
Okay, any more hands in the air? Yes.
Hi. It's not actually a fully formed question, but I was curious when you said something about the intellectual as an amateur, and then you made a comparison, like the designer as an amateur. And I was thinking if you see a relationship with that on that critics of design thinking, because I don't know, I was thinking that we see this design thinking as something very product and solutions, you know, oriented. And I don't know, when I think about amateurs, I don't know, it's something more related to the process maybe, and a bit less, I don't know, I don't think I can fully form a question. I would just like to hear more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I like this idea of this, but I guess I've written about the idea of a designer being a generalist, so kind of having an overview of things. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with specialization, but if one is just tied to their specialism, then they forget that there's a world outside of that informs the things that they do. And that's what's interesting about this idea of the amateur, is like for the love of something, right? So it's something that I love very much, that I want to know more about. And so I delve into it, and how does that inform what I do? And I think that's why you broaden that scope a little bit. I'm not saying that, and I'm not one of those proponents of everybody is a designer. That's not my thing. I think, but then there's also this. I guess it's funny. It's either like you're this professional designer, or you're this completely everybody is a designer. There's no in between. There's no nuance. But there's so much nuance to what I'm trying to kind of inject into this idea of the designer as an amateur. Because I think it was Michael Beirut who said that not everything is about design, but design is about everything, right? And so what we're doing, what informs what I'm doing, and having a bit of knowledge about it, but also acknowledging what I don't know and who I have to work with in order to know and make this informed thing, I think is quite important and at the center of this idea of the designer as a generalist, the designer as an amateur.
Okay, maybe there's time for one more question.
I don't think it's...
Hi? Yeah,
Hello?
okay. So I thank you. I had a lecture with you 4 years ago in my MA in LCC, and
right.
that's why I'm here. And it's not a question again, but I'm really curious to know more about this lack of imagination and a bit about where we should start researching or what we should do to enlarge our horizons of imagination in today's world.
Yeah. So, I mean, this lack of imagination, I guess you just see the way that society is moving towards kind of the example of the subscription services, you know, these solutions that you end up seeing that are the same outcome, a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and reflects that idea that, you know, our boredom has been hijacked, but then when you look at the cultural production that's out there, a lot of it is the same thing. It's like a remake of a remake of a remake of a remake. And that's one way, I guess, Mark Fisher's argument is that because your boredom has been hijacked, you don't have the space and time to think. And that leads to a lack of imagination. Think about it. Boredom is an extremely difficult feeling to sit with. But it's also a great feeling to sit with, because with boredom comes, oh, what can I create? What can I produce? You know, and then these ideas. And also gathering, sitting together, being together. And I guess, where do we research? What should we do? The first thing is really to begin to practice this idea of critical thinking, to ask yourselves these difficult questions, which, again, you could, I don't want to kind of promote this book as a starting point, but it in a way is like, okay, what does this make me think about? What can I add to this? What can I learn from this? What do how do I begin to create my own inventory? And then how do I start to be curious and discover these things? I think is one of the first steps to do it, rather than following this, and this is again difficult to do because it's become so formulaic with, you know, double diamond design thinking process, right? Is that people start to think of everything as a step, as a formula. But if you start to take that away and start to let yourself kind of go into territory that is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is important. We tend to be very weary of it. It's understandable. Nobody wants to be uncomfortable. But if you do sit with that discomfort, what does that then do to you and inform you and kind of trickle in the imagination? Yeah, I guess it's just thinking about, like, there's this restraint on what is possible, and then it becomes the space of science fiction. But then starting to think about, how do I use my imagination to think of things that may seem impossible, but that could be also grounded in some form of reality. I don't know, that's kind of one place that I would say you could start.
Okay, are we still okay for one more question in terms of time? Yeah, so if there's one final question, or everyone might already be looking forward to lunch already. Okay, well, so if there's no further questions, would like to thank Danah for joining us today, everyone for being here, of course, the Center for Other Worlds at Lusofon University, and Matt for the organization and for this ongoing program, and always giving us space to bring fantastic people like Danah here to share her thoughts and her research and her interests, and I hope that the book will still be able to provide fertile ground for more conversations, and I'm sure it will in weeks to come, and at university and at home and elsewhere, and that hopefully you enjoyed this contribution to your own journey as designers, or other things you might imagine otherwise. So thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.